everyone. My name is Erin Buckwalter. I work for NOFA Vermont, and we're really excited today to have Natasha Bowens here. She just finished keynoting our winter conference, and we're going to talk a little bit about her work. So, hi Natasha, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to just give everyone a quick little overview about what you've been up to these last 6 years?
Yes. So basically, I left working in healthcare advocacy in DC, and I started farming. I got really into the food movement, and I just really found a need to kind of dig into some stories and into some issues that I was seeing as far as racial inequities and injustices in the food movement and the system itself. So I started this project that I called The Color of Food. Really, I started writing on my blog called Brown Girl Farming and writing for Grist Magazine in a series called The Color of Food, and it just kind of snowballed into what became a photographic storytelling project where I interviewed over 75 farmers and food activists of color, so specifically from Black, Latina, Asian, and Native communities. And now this photographic storytelling project has turned into a book.
And the book comes out a couple months, right?
Yeah, it comes out in April, published by New Society Publishers, and it's filled with portrait photos and stories from some of these farmers. So.
Great. So is there a point in your career as a healthcare advocate that kind of sparked you to make this change? Like, what was that moment like?
Definitely. And there were definitely key moments that were pivotal, and then they kind of gradually all came together as this just undeniable elephant in the room, I kind of call it. For me personally, I really got into environmental activism after college and was slowly starting to see how the way we grow our food impacts the environment. But then I worked for the Center for American Progress in DC. I was working to support youth activism on college campuses. And I had switched focus from environment issues to healthcare issues because it was right when we were working to pass the health reform bill when Obama came into office. And, it was my first time really starting to understand the complex healthcare system, but obviously with a knowledge of the status of America's health right now, right? These really high rates of diet-related illnesses. And then, of course, as a person of color, social justice issues were always at the center of my focus. And I could just see that all these issues were just kind of revolving around food, and it was this unspoken elephant in the room. And that's when I decided to kind of shift gears and focus.
Yeah, cool. And what made you want to take on the storytelling of farming and the way that you've done it, like such a multimedia type of way?
Well, I think that, I was working in D.C., which is a policy-heavy, very wonky kind of place to be. You're always reading heavy statistical reports. You're lobbying on Congress. There's always conferences where educated panelists are shooting out these statistics. And I felt like it dehumanized the issues because we're talking about people at the end of the day. We're talking about food. We're talking about real communities, real people who are suffering with diabetes and whatnot. And I just felt like that storytelling piece was really missing. And particularly in the food movement, again, when I started to learn myself about, okay, what's up with the inequities, not only in, talking about food justice and access to healthy foods and kind of like farm worker issues and some of these common food justice issues, but also as a girl who started farming, where were the other farmers of color and why are our numbers so low? And so you can find that information in the agricultural census, but I wanted to hear from these folks, And there's so much history kind of involved with, that dynamic and untold stories. So I was just, drawn to the storytelling human aspect of it.
Makes me think I've been reading Americana by, I don't know how you say it. Do you know how to say her name?
No.
Amanda Adichie?
Yeah, it's a hard one.
Yeah, and she has a YouTube, a TED Talk, I guess.
Yeah.
The Danger of a Single Story. And, there is this kind of prevalent story that we tell in our society about farmers, and that's very dangerous to kind of bury a lot of other people's stories. So it's really great that you're bringing them to light. Have you seen kind of tangible shifts in the conversation since you started, or what are some ways that your storytelling is shifting the landscape for farmers of color?
Wow, well, that's a pretty big goal, and I would hope
right?
that I am shifting that vast landscape. But I think first, when I when I started this project, I myself started looking through this other lens outside of the dominant narrative, and saw a lot of folks that have already been doing this work and already trying to kind of reclaim agrarian identity for communities of color. And they have really been shaping and impacting the landscape for farmers of color. Names that come to mind are like Malik Yakini, Ralph Page, Dr. Monica White. There's so many folks that have been doing this work for so long. I can only hope that my work can impact this landscape. But that being said, it's really been an honor to be invited to speak alongside some of these folks and present these stories at places like Tuskegee and big land-grant universities like here and Purdue. And just the simple fact of, all the attention that the project has gotten, and the stories, the impact that these stories are having on folks every time I present them and every time I write about them. It's really powerful to see folks coming up and saying, wow, Black folks coming up to me at the last conference I was at and saying, when you started talking about this, I had a painful reaction, just remembering the history of my family who were sharecroppers. And I almost wanted to get up and leave the room because I just was like, I can't sit here and talk about this. But he stayed. And afterwards he was like, hearing these stories has shifted how I'm looking at this. And another aside that I didn't quite answer in the last question was not only is the storytelling, but the photography aspect of it, just seeing these faces, right, repainting the faces. It's kind of, I present with a lot of universities, and so young students are coming up, and I see faces that look like mine. This is a place for me. I can be involved in this movement. And finally, when I started the project, I also had grand ambitions to create a map and directory of a lot of the farmers I was interviewing and try to get as many farmers of color on there. And there are quite a lot of farmers on there. And through that, I've had tons of young farmers of color contact me and say, I found a farm to work on. Awesome. To start learning from this farmer, this mentor farmer, because I wanted to find another Black farmer, another Latina farmer, and this project has helped that. So yeah. I think in small ways it's definitely making an impact.
Yeah, great. And I know you highlighted some really great stories in our keynote, but are there some like really kind of maybe what are some of the most exciting ways that you're seeing farmers of color kind of taking on these issues in their community and, either addressing access or really pushing on the system to change?
Well, I think that the key is that, and I often don't like to use the term food justice. I like to use food sovereignty. And the key to sovereignty is, you have control over your food system, over your seeds, over your traditional food ways. And I think that that's been the most powerful piece to see in these communities, that's what they're talking about. And that's the story that they're telling. They're concerned about food access and health in the communities, but it's more an all-encompassing goal. And, a lot of the stories that I've found to be kind of most powerful in that way or most creative is in a lot of Native American communities, like the Cherokee community that I mentioned, at the Center for Cherokee Plants. They're, number one, I think it's really cool the structure of their seed bank. They're propagating and saving seed, but they're not sitting on those seeds and seedlings. They're turning them into garden kits and giving them out to the residents on the reservation. And then that's not all they're doing. They're also going around with their mobile classroom, and they talked about how they go around to the different, and they kind of help re-educate folks, because these skills, they are in the community, but they may have been lost over generations. So just kind of reminding folks that this is what we used to do. And, let's put the blanket out, let's sit in the yard, we're here, we're coming to see you, and we're going to talk about these things. We're going to do some storytelling and bring back some traditional Cherokee folklore around food and farming. And I found that to be pretty creative. Also in the Muckleshoot tribe in Washington, Similarly, Valerie Seagrust, who's a native foods educator, takes groups out to harvest some of the traditional wild medicines and wild foods, and again,
Awesome.
like incorporating storytelling with that. So I'm
Cool.
drawn to the storytelling projects, of course. But
Yeah, that's great. Well, so it sounds like a lot of younger people are also, they're really drawn to these stories because they're able to see themselves in those stories and feel like they can be a part of the movement.
yeah.
I think that that's a really powerful aspect of your stories is, it's, I think with such a history of oppression in agriculture, seeing agriculture as a viable work,
Exactly.
to actually see people like ourselves doing that work is it's really important.
And I think it's an overlooked aspect of it all, but it's really important for everyone getting into farming. I was just recently at a conference where J.M. Fortier, the market gardener farmer, was telling his story of how he got started, and I noticed that he was saying he worked down on farms in Mexico and in Cuba, and he was like kind of traveling around and working, but where he found his real mentor that he really learned from in New Mexico was another Francophone, another French farmer. And there was just, he wasn't telling the story for that point, but that's what I saw in it is look at that connection that he had because it was somebody like him. And I think we overlook that kind of cultural understanding, connection that's really key when you're learning from someone.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. Great. And so it sounds like you've got a new project going on. So you've been on the road for many years, and now you're kind of have a new home base.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what that looks like?
Sure. So, I'm originally from Florida. I was in New York and D.C. when I kind of started this project, and of course all over the place for a couple years on the road doing this project. And now I've just gotten married and settled down in Western Maryland outside of D.C., and with the book kind of off my plate as far as all the transcription and writing and getting it published, I'm ready to get my hands back in the soil. Remember that's kind of what I wanted to do when I left my work in D.C., and I was called to kind of dig into something else other than the soil for a few years. But yeah, I'm ready to get my hands back in the soil. So I'm actually part of the beginning farmer training program with CASA, the Chesapeake Association for Sustainable Agriculture, there in the region. And I also, just kind of was going around the community and seeing what was going on as far as food and farming and where my skills might be handy. And I was asked to help support an urban youth farm, educational farm, and start one in Frederick. So I'm working with the housing authority there where they already have community gardens, and the residents really want to enhance their growing and access to healthy foods. So I'll be supporting that and starting some programs there.
Oh, that sounds like so much fun. Cool. So maybe the last question is like the biggest and hardest. But I think a lot about kind of just the institutionalized racism and systemic issues of oppression in our food system. And in Vermont, it's 95% white state, and I think the stories that you tell are often really hidden. And how do you recommend kind of we as consumers and farmers and buyers, how do we help start uncovering those layers so that it's more seen? How can we do that here in Vermont?
Yeah, and it's, actually one of the students here just came up to me after the talk and asked the same question. And first of all, that's the first step, is just kind of having that light go off in the community and having that desire and will to go out and uncover those stories. And it's about finding the folks that are here, though they may be few in numbers, finding those folks. And, like I said in my speech, when folks aren't at the table, I think a lot of the problems in the movement is like, okay, we need everybody at the table. So, come sit at our table. Why aren't you coming to the table? Sometimes you have to go, knock on their doors, and ask to sit and listen at their tables, right? Go into these communities where work is being done, gather these stories, and then just help amplify them. I mean, that's what I felt called to do. Because similarly, I just wanted to know how can I start pushing for this. So I went and knocked on people's doors, gathered their stories, and I'm trying my best to amplify them and just support the work. And this is a whole other conversation we can get into, and I will be digging into it with the students at the Green Mountain College residency this week, but just about how the movement can start shifting the dynamic of how we do support work, like who is in control of like who gets to make the decision, who gets to make, who is deciding, who is leading the movement, you know, who's deciding where the funding and the support is going to, right? So that's a much bigger beast to tackle, but we can definitely just at least start having these conversations because that's really how we get at amplifying and supporting this work.
Well, I'm really excited to keep continuing having these conversations here in Vermont and really pushing the food system here to amplify these voices too. So,
well, I think the first step was NOFA having this theme of growing the good food movement and all the conversations that are going to happen this weekend. So we just got to keep them going.
Yeah,
so yeah,
awesome.
You guys should be proud that you're starting this conversation.
So to see Natasha's full keynote, please visit the NOFA Vermont YouTube channel. And to learn more about what Natasha's up to, you can visit her website, thecoloroffood.com. And please don't forget to check out her book, which comes out in a couple months. Thanks so much for coming, Natasha. It's really great to talk with you, and we really appreciate you sharing your stories and